Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this week's episode of Guyana's Oil and You. I'm your hostess, editor of Kaieteur News, Kiana Wilberg, and joining us tonight are two prominent gentlemen in the business community, Mr. Timothy Tucker, who is the head of the Georgetown Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and Mr. Richard Rambaran, executive director at GCCI as well. Gentlemen, welcome to the program, and thank you for making the time to be here.
Well, thank you very much. Good night to you too, and good night to all your listeners.
Thank you, Kiana. Thank you for having us.
No problem. So, tonight we will be discussing several issues related to local content, a very critical matter as it relates to the oil and gas industry. And both of you gentlemen have very passionate but distinct views on this matter. So, tonight we'll get right into it. Mr. Tucker, I'd like to start with you. Now, in getting local content right in both policy and legislation, one of the key things any nation has to get right is what constitutes local or a local company. So, based on your observations thus far, what, in your view, should this definition be fashioned to mean?
Well, the definition of local content is very important. Of course, that defines the whole entire process. It defines what the country is expecting,
Yes.
and what our future holds. If you look at local content, then local content is generally what we're going to get as a nation from this find. We all know the position, we've seen and heard numerous times the position of the contract. So local content is the guaranteed way for Guyanese to benefit from the natural resources that we have found offshore of Guyana that will be developed. What we mean by local content, we don't mean that local content is only for Guyanese and we should put a blockade or a dome over Guyana. We mean that when various aspects of the oil and gas industries, things that Guyanese can qualify for, or they're certified for, or they have the capacity to do, should be given to Guyanese. We should be considered first. And so we are asking for local content to mean the first consideration for the opportunities that are there. So advertise it locally, see what capacity is locally, and then give us the opportunity to do the work. If you have then if we don't have the capacity locally, then you can go regionally, then you can go internationally, and you can seek capacity, or you could seek those persons that can fulfill the supply of goods and services. So local content also must mean benefits for locals. So the beneficiary ownership of that business should remain local. So you're looking at not just, okay, Richard owns 51% of a company and I'm a foreigner, and Richard has signed an MOU that says that, okay, he is 51% ownership, but I have his voting rights. I have, he gives me, let's say, 95% of his profits is remitted to me, and then we move the money out of Guyana and we have the board meetings and everything is controlled overseas. No, that's not local content. That's rent a citizenship. That's rent a citizen, basically. I'm renting Richard and I'm leasing Richard just to use his name. No, we don't want that. We want beneficial partnerships. Whereas Richard is 51% owner of the company, he has a say. The board meetings are in Guyana. Richard retains 51% of the profits. We're not dictating what people do with their profits, but we believe that a lot of the spend and the reinvestment should be made into the country. And that's what we mean by local content. So it's not saying that we don't want foreigners coming in, we don't want foreign direct investment. Foreign direct investment is quite fine. We should have that. What we need is persons coming in, and if you are a foreign direct investor and you decide that you do not want a local, then if you're coming regionally, then you have to toe the line. Your second choice. If you're coming internationally, then your third choice. but Guyanese should be given the first preference. First, sorry, and let me rephrase that. Sorry, I made a mistake there. First consideration.
Okay.
First preference will violate the WTO rules, and that's why we're very cautious. Because first preference now breaches a lot of the conventions worldwide, the trade conventions that Guyana has signed on to. First consideration is acceptable.
Thank you for that explanation. Now, Mr. Rambaran, given what Mr. Tucker said and the point that he made about the fact that the GCCI and himself by extension, there's no fear as to, other companies venturing into Guyana, but at the end of the day, there must be meaningful partnership. So that is to say that the GCCI is not at all concerned about the influx of Trinidadian companies that we've been seeing as of late.
So I want firstly to perhaps buttress what the president of the chamber has said, and maybe give it a bit more of a generality before I delve into the specific response, in the sense that local content, irrespective of what instrument or tool or policy measure is used, local content refers to value retention in the country. So what percentage or what quantum of the value which is generated from the particular sector is retained in the country, whether it be through earnings, whether it be through the size of the procurement, whether it be through a majority share, irrespective of what tool we use. So that being said, the Georgetown Chamber of Commerce and Industry in particular, since the beginning of this local content advance and proposition that we've been making, has always said that we will support and we have been supportive of partnerships and joint ventureships in the oil and gas sector, but also for the peripheral sectors which support and benefit or are beneficiaries of the oil and gas sector development. So that in itself has been demonstrated through the actions of the Chamber of Commerce, where we have actually fielded trade missions to other oil and gas producing countries, more mature economies, more mature oil and gas sectors, where we can see where they are, we can benefit from what they have learned over time. And so the Guyanese businessmen and the Guyanese enterprises in general do not have to go through that steep learning curve on their own. So this is why, irrespective of which country, I don't want to single out any country, but irrespective of which country it is, we have always taken the position that we must promote partnerships and joint ventureships so as to encourage a mutually beneficial relationship.
So, just to get back to the question, we have seen that a number of Trinidadian companies have been coming to these shores. We had Rams Logistics in the beginning, and we're seeing quite a few others in various aspects as it relates to healthcare, safety, and the environment, etc., coming to these shores, setting up operations. Are you saying, given your position, that Guyanese should be partners with these companies that have years of experience? Is that what you're proposing?
Yes, so Guyana, essentially, there are fields where Guyanese do not have, and very flatly just do not have the experience or the exposure within an international business sense. Therefore, it would be more beneficial for a Guyanese company to be able to partner with someone as opposed to being locked out of an industry completely. And what I mean by that is that you're in a situation where an ideal or an optimum outcome would have been a Guyanese company. If you were looking at it with the lens of local content and economic development, you would have wanted a local company, for example, to be the maximum owner, to be the person who is controlling. But in the absence of being able to reach that optimal condition, you utilize the second best option, which is partnering with someone. So for example, we may not have in Guyana the ability to do complex subsea engineering processes, But we will have Guyanese persons who are skilled. We will have Guyanese persons who understand logistics, who understand the administrative process, who understand how to navigate the landscape, who understand how to put together plans, move through the local institutions. Now, those are other components of business that are very important. Those are skills which Guyanese enterprises and Guyanese businessmen have, which, for example, a company now entering to Guyana may not have that degree of expertise. And therefore, it ought to be, and obviously will be, a mutually beneficial relationship. So I track back to say that, yes, this is the reason why the Georgetown Chamber of Commerce and Industry in particular has always encouraged joint ventureships and partnerships. We have, since the beginning of this fight, if you want to call it a fight, but we have been since the beginning recognized or in recognition and cognizant of the fact that we do not have extraordinary technical expertise as opposed to other countries. So relatively we're at a disadvantage, and the way that we go about ensuring maximum in-country retention of value is through joint ventureships and through partnerships. So irrespective of the country, that is the modus operandi and the rubric which we have always promoted.
Thank you for that. Now, Mr. Tucker, in the past few weeks, we've seen GCCI reignite its call for a local content policy and the requisite legislation in place. Can you say what are some of the observations in the sector from your members that prompted GCCI to come forward once again with this call? And are you disappointed that it has taken so long for us to get off the ground with the legislation?
All right, so your last part of your question first, yes. We are disappointed that it's taking this long, but we understand the need to get it right. So even though the government has, we're disappointed that it's taken so long, we understand that the government is in a position where it's trying to make sure that they get it right. But the GCCI's position is, if we are able to implement it, we don't see it as a one-off, put a law in place and leave it and let it grow. We think that that there must be a national or a local content commission. Local content commission will make sure that it's a living, breathing legislation, and that commission looks at the local content. Because of course, with a local content legislation, there has to be penalties. There have to be an oversight of the industry to make sure that those who are operating within the industry, right, are doing what the legislation says that they should be doing. They're reaching the targets, they're employing Guyanese, they're procuring locally, right, and they're engaging Guyanese. And that retention of the finances is done locally. And all those things need to be measured, but it just don't need to be measured and rest in a place where nobody's going to find it. It needs a commission to constantly and on a daily basis analyze the data that's coming in from the industry, making sure that those companies that are operating in the industry they're adhering to the laws that we put in place. So that will by itself guide the industry. We will know where we don't have capacity. We will know where we have capacity, and we can adjust the targets to suit what we have and what we don't have. And that is a living, breathing commission that can do those things. So that is what the GCCI has been advocating for. A local content policy or local content legislation, but also a local content commission that looks over the input of the legislation. And so that's the latter part of your question. I think the first part of your question...
what were some of the main observations or complaints, that prompted the calls that you've been making recently?
Right. So the GCCI has received several complaints. We've had complaints that, companies coming into the country that basically are being chosen above Guyanese, and Guyanese have the capabilities of providing that service, as simple as trucking, transportation, logistics, ship chandlery, custom brokerage, immigration clearances, and the list goes on. Recruitment. The list is very long. Excuse me if I can't remember every part of it. Also, we're looking at, we receive complaints about not being, local companies not being aware of the opportunities that exist in the oil and gas sector. So you have situations where companies come into the country and it's no fault of the operator. The operator hires a tier one contractor. That tier one contractor hires a procurement company. That procurement company has a task. The task is to provide 10 bottles of water, 200 feet of pipe, and a truck to move the pipe. They're new into Guyana. They're not a member of the GCCI. They're not a member. They're not familiar with Guyana, right? They're not. They completely don't know anything here, but they have been operating in other countries. And what they do is they rely on the capabilities that they use in the other countries. So they land in Guyana, they get that contract. They have bid for that contract outside of Guyana. They set up office in Guyana because they have to set up office in Guyana. And they now say, listen, I need this, I need water, I need pipes, and I need trucks to move it. Who do we know? We know these companies that we've been dealing with in that other country. And they simply go and they said, can you provide this service for us? Continue to provide this service that you've been providing in that other country in Guyana. So they didn't even bother to look into Guyana, and there's nothing forcing them to advertise for that procurement in country. So that's why the GCCI has been pushing, because if they had advertised for that position, for those services, goods and services locally, they would have known we've had many companies that are capable of providing. And apart from that, if you decided, let's say you're editor of Kaieteur News, and you have to provide, you wanted to have a trucking service right now. How do you get in? What do you do to get into that trucking service? What are the requirements? If you had to bring a truck into Guyana, you will know exactly. You could go to GRA and you can punch into their website and you can see what is it. You could put the cost of your truck, the type of truck, the year of the truck, and you could put it into the GRA's website. It will generate the duty and taxes that you would have to pay. What are the requirements when that truck comes? If you can't bring the truck that is over 8 years old, it says so. Right? If your truck needs to have no panels or whatever it is, or a bus or whatever you're bringing in, it tells you so. Can you tell me what are the requirements for you to provide a trucking service for the oil and gas industry in Guyana? I can't tell you that. I'm sure Richard can't tell you that, and I'm pretty sure that you wouldn't be able to tell me that. That's some of the issues that we're having, and we've expressed that to the Center of Local Business Development. We've said to them that there is a distinct, people feel locked out of the industry because there's no way there's no information there to say, listen, you need to have your trucks Department of Transportation, which is the U.S. Department of Transportation certified. So this is a checklist, and this is how you can enter the industry. When you say, there are companies that complain to us that, listen, we've been through the process of ISO certified. ISO certification, for what they're trying to do, is just one part. So they think that they've crossed that threshold and they've now, they're in the game, and to realize that, that didn't really matter. You really need to have all your personnel certified in a particular part, some kind of certification whether it's US, UK, or whatever certified, because there's no general or I should say universal certification in Guyana that says, okay, if I go to the Bureau of Standards, I'm certified, and I can now provide that service to any part of the industry. There's nothing like that. You generally do not have that information at hand. And that is some of the complaints that we've been getting. We've also gotten complaints about delays in payments. Mistaken invoices, and then, of course, you believe, like everywhere else, we believe we hand in an invoice and we said, okay, we got a net 60 days. There's a net 60 days. The 61st day arrive, and you call for your payment. It says, your payment is on hold because there was an issue with your invoice. You classified something wrong. That clock starts back.
Okay.
And in Guyana, if you think about it, the clock starts back, and you're a local business, and we're not talking about 200,000, 300,000 Guyana dollars. We're talking about 500,000 US, a million US, and excess. Think about it now that you, in a country that you're paying, that you have interest rates that are 10% and higher. Minimum that anybody can get is probably about 8%. And let's use 8% then. So 8% of $1 million and divided by 12 and then multiplied by the 6 months that you're waiting, that's what you're losing. And if you're competing with countries or companies that from countries that the interest rate is below 3%, that's why Guyanese can't be competitive, because there's no local content without cheap financing and better access to financing. We can't compete, period. Even if you give us a 5%. I mean, if we look at it, the government instituted a 20% of all government contracts are to small businesses, and that allows a 5% add-on. So if you have a large company bidding for a small contract and a small business bidding for that same contract, and the small business is 5% higher than that big company, the government accepts the bid as equal, and they evaluate it as the equal pricing. Even if we do that in the oil and gas sector, and we force the oil and gas sector to do it based on the access to finance and the cost of financing, we still can't compete. So access to finance and local content has to go hand in hand.
Thank you very much for that. Richard, I suppose you'd like to jump in here.
Guyana, I just wanted to maybe add a little bit of further context.
Sure.
In a general sense, what the Chamber of Commerce has been receiving from its membership is a degree of frustration in the local private sector regarding access to the industry and participation in the industry. Whether it is on the front of a technical matter or whether it's on the front of a commercial obstruction. So whether they are uncompetitive or whether there is some technical, in trade you would refer to it as a technical barrier to entry. So whether it's a technical barrier that is erected in some way, shape, or form, or whether it's something to do with the business environment, for example, access to finance, that makes a local company uncompetitive. One thing which we have to remember and pay keen attention to is the fact that we are not absolutely new at this point in time, coming down to the latter part of 2021. We're not absolutely new any longer to the oil and gas game. Companies now have been established, some of them 6 years experience, some of them even longer because they were helping with even pre-discovery exploration. So it is for some companies in excess of half a decade, for some going on to a decade, and still there isn't a clear path delineated as to where it is that we ought to go, how it is that we access this,
How is it that we access that? So you think about yourself in the average business person's shoes. Um, you have you firstly have to get over some of the local hurdles that we face in terms of the environment, in terms of some of the barriers that exist, or some of the features of our economy that would make enterprises less competitive than other enterprises which may emanate from other countries. And you think about that as well as or supported by the fact that you are now entering into a fairly new industry. You're entering into an industry where the degree of information as to entry is not as prominent as it maybe can be. And further to that, you do have this feature of what is termed as relational contracting, where people are coming with prior networks and prior linkages and prior supplier arrangements, etc. And you put yourself in the average Guyanese business person's shoes, and you would realize that there is a high degree of frustration that would emanate as a result of it. So it is contingent on that, that really the Georgetown Chamber of Commerce and Industry not just reignited its call, but has been calling for this all along. As you would be aware, we have been on this call for local content, either policy or legislation, and support landscape and architecture for the past 6-7 years. So this really is something that it is becoming a point of frustration for the local private sector. And this is the reason why the Chamber of Commerce, being a body that represents the views of its membership, advances this call. It's important for us to remember that we're not sitting here as a result of our personal feelings to something, but what we are telling you is an amalgamation of discussions, complaints, letters which have been written to us, persons expressing their sentiments, etc., on an almost daily basis. So we sit as representatives of the membership.
What I would ask to that is, you said you spoke with the Center for Local Business Development, which is Exxon's the sort of extension for businesses that want to be part of the supply chain. I understand that ExxonMobil is also one of the members of GCCI.
Yes, they are.
Have you sought at any point in time to say, okay, Exxon, let's have a sit down? The other members are not pleased with the level of procurement that is taking place. Guyanese local companies are being sidelined. Has that occurred?
Well, generally that conversation happens through the Center of Local Business Development, because that's the mechanism for procurement and for advertising of procurement. We've had a lengthy discussion with them. We've explained our entire position.
How long ago was this?
This was probably about 2 weeks ago.
At most.
Yeah, 2 or 3 weeks ago. So they've used that mechanism, and we've sat down with them, and we have gone through the entire process and what we have all the issues with. Exxon is an active member of the GCCI. They sit on our petroleum committee. They're involved with the GCCI. But as I said to you earlier, it may not. A lot of the issues that we have are not directly linked to the operator, but more so to the subcontractors and the different contractors. I mean, you see Exxon trying to do what it is that they need to do, and we have had conversations with them one-on-one, and they've said, listen, we have tried this and this and that and that, and they've gone through it. And we get the complaints from many different members. Remember, the GCCI, it's not just all big bodies. We have a broad cross section of membership. Our membership runs from micro enterprises all the way, so mom and pop stores, little, event management companies, all the way to ExxonMobil, Banks DIH, right up at the top. So we're actually, this month we're gonna cross 500 members. So organization that size, right? 500 members in a small country. It's a lot of members, a lot of business support that we offer. So we get various views from everybody. the dispensation of our membership, it's basically 20 something percent. The category 1, which is basically the highest category A membership, is around 23%.
Yeah.
Right, whereas that middle sector is 26 and 20 and probably 24, right, and then the bottom micro businesses is lower. I am a small business owner, so I can tell you that there's issues, and the issues that I would come across is not me operating with Exxon, it's me operating maybe with one of their subcontractors.
But this is not the first time GCCI would have been speaking about these very issues. If memory serves me right, you guys have been speaking about these very matters even up to last year.
GCCI has been speaking about these issues, and GCCI has been chasing down local content for, Richard is now serving as third president. So this is a situation. That's why he's so familiar, because if you could remember, I think Richard wrote the first, Richard and our president, when it was Deodat Indar, had wrote the first local content policy and submitted to government before the government had even attempted to write a local content policy. So the idea is that we understand that there is a desperate need for a legislation at this point, and we've gone past policy.
Mm-hmm.
We've totally gone past policy. We need legislation at this point in time. The legislation ensures, think about it this way, if Kaieteur News had to look at every delivery person, every person that delivers newspapers for you, and you had to make sure that they deliver papers in the proper manner in which you would like it to be done, that would be a very tedious job. And I don't expect Exxon to look at every single subcontractor to make sure. You could imagine how tedious it is when they also have to look after their responsibilities as a global company, right? So it is there that we are at a point where we can't put all the blame at the foot of Exxon, right? When as a country, we can put the policy or the legislation in place that makes sure that everybody that works for Exxon is doing the right thing, or they will pay the penalty. And that is what is needed. Because we cannot look at the police, look at the laws of Guyana. We put all the burden on the police force. We have to be able, as citizens of the country, to adhere to the laws of the country. And that is what needs to be done. And the police is just the enforcer of the laws of the country. And that's why we need a new law called Local Content Legislation Bill.
Okay. So based on the feedback that you've received from your members, there is a dissatisfaction with the manner in which award of contracts are being handed out, particularly by the subcontractors to locals versus foreigners.
It's generally, yes. We believe that there are local contractors that can qualify. Those local contractors have large amount of, they have the capacity to perform. Some of them have been employed, and they have been employed, and they've been getting the minimum amount of work. Mm-hmm. Where there are other persons that are in here that are getting more work. And if you look at it, right, it's a situation where you have and as Richard alluded to earlier, and I did myself, is that you have a situation where familiarity in the industry is creating a preference over locals. So because...
Have you looked at the numbers, though, for that? In terms of your membership, to say, well, okay, from 2020, we have complaints of 50 companies, of our companies being, our members being sidelined when they have the capacity. in comparison to foreigners. And now in 2021, we've seen the complaints grow from 50 to 150 or 120. Have you sit down and really look at the numbers?
We have not sat down and looked at the numbers in terms of comparison from that year to this year in terms of the complaints. What we have seen is whenever the GC, and the complaints always increase when we are vocal. So we may receive 10 complaints and we become vocal, and then we receive 30 more. And that is generally the pattern. I mean, we know, we live in Guyana. Nobody complains about the neighbor's dog until one person complains about the neighbor's dog. And that's generally how Guyanese operate. And I think at this point in time, we have to understand, and we have to look at it as a society, that we cannot just be a society of complainers, right? There's one complaint that we need to make, which is we need a local content legislation in place with clear definitions on how Guyanese are to benefit.
Okay.
The second thing that we need to do is to build capacity locally to make sure that we reap the benefits of that local content legislation when it's put in place. And we don't have to wait till the local content legislation, but we need to start building it now. We have to realize that we're in an oil and gas era. Last year, we saw oil at about $20, $25 a barrel, right? And the world thought that oil is a thing of the past. We are presently at $80, $85 a barrel. Every single major economic forum around the world is flabbergasted at this point in time that renewables are not running and overpowering oil and gas. Oil and gas has made a resurgence because most of the companies, major oil companies around the world, have realized that, okay, they need to diversify and go into renewables, and they've cut production. Now there's a demand as the world is opening back up, and there will always be a demand when the world opens back up fully. And that has created a demand. And we now in Guyana, at $80 or $85 a barrel, how could we, over the years, we've been suffering in this country for 54 years, 55 years, right? And we are at a point now where we have the opportunity to get that income to change our future, to change the way the country is, what we see in the country, how we are able to sit here in a room full of electricity and not a room full of flambeaux, right? We have to realize that at some point in time, we have to use what God has given us to create a future that we can give to our children. And if we don't realize that and we don't reap the benefits and the opportunities that are in front of us and take advantage of and ensure that we as Guyanese benefit and we don't end up with an empty hole in the ground and we haven't gotten nothing from it, then we are in a sad place. You have to take the opportunities, what are in front of you, all of it. And we have to use what we have gained and what we've gotten to develop our country. And we cannot just develop an oil and gas nation. We have to develop a nation. We have to develop all industries. We have to get proper roads, proper infrastructure, better electricity, cheaper electricity. The private sector for years, for decades, has been begging for cheaper electricity. There is nothing, absolutely nothing that you can say to the private sector that will say, we don't want cheaper electricity. We need cheap electricity. That's what's going to reduce the cost of everything.
It's interesting that you said that we need to build not just an oil and gas economy, it needs to be diversified. And this brings me to the next aspect of the discussion this evening, and it has to do with the draft schedule that was sent out to the business community and other industry stakeholders. That first schedule of the draft Local Content Act has about 150 areas for Guyanese to participate, and there's sliding targets. The government is proposing a number of areas for Guyanese to have an increased level of participation, and majority you see 90% to 100% within 10 years for oil companies, oil contractors, and their subcontractors. So with over 150 areas for local participation and a population that has just about 700,000 people, do you think those targets are practical? Mr. Rembrandt, I'd like to start with you.
Sure. Yeah, so it's 153 services or subsectors that they have referred to. Now, one thing to remember about the oil and gas sector is that it is not one that is labor intensive in particular. It is one that is capital intensive. Therefore, by logical extension, it is not in so much as the population will determine whether we can do it or not, but it is the conditions around access to capital, conditions around enterprise, conditions around competitiveness. Those are the conditions which will really determine whether or not we are able to capitalize or utilize those opportunities which are given. So absolutely, it is not one where we have to only view the construct as regards labor. And of course, you, Guyana, yourself, you would have written a very nice op-ed on the IOM work, which I was a part of producing the report, where even if we take all of the persons in Guyana who are unemployed, informally employed, underemployed, and we forecast what the demand for labor is in the medium term, even if we take all of those persons, it still will not reach that capacity. So certainly we are cognizant of the fact that you do need to have some degree of migrant labor to support the local industry, not and also by logical extension or more broadly, support enterprise in Guyana. So to answer your question, it is not contingent solely on the population. That, of course, plays a factor because once you have a shortage of supply, or once you have a shortage in labor supply, you obviously will drive wages up or drive salaries up. In a manner which will make the company or make the enterprise or the landscape become uncompetitive. But it is more focused on the conditions that support enterprise. And that really is what is important, especially in an industry that is capital intensive.
So you do believe that the targets are practical?
So there
once the right policies are there.
So there are elements in the first schedule of the local content bill that I believe are practical. There are elements where I think that we are already there. So take, for example, Guyanese enterprises have been doing chandeliering for in terms of shipping. Guyanese companies have been doing logistics. Guyanese companies have been doing trucking and trucking by standards, industry standards, for many, many years. So some of them we are already there. And you will see, of course, the Chamber of Commerce making some of its commentary, etc., public on it. But it's important also, Guyana, for us to be able to look at some of these from an empirical standpoint. And this is where I think if there is to be some analysis of where a gap is that we should have, perhaps as a country, and this is not any indictment on anyone at this point in time, but we should have had for quite some time now as a country a firm and thorough empirical analysis of what our productive capacity is in the sectors or in the subsectors. Not just what we're doing, but based on the conditions, where it is that we can reach, where it is that we can go, what is it that we can achieve. I do believe that, if I'm not mistaken, that the Center for Local Business Development has done some of that work. I'm not absolutely sure, but it is something that we ought to do as a country.
Independently. But just to get back to the original question, you said that you believe that for some of the targets, when you reviewed it, some we can get to, some of which we're already there.
Yes.
But what I'm asking is, do you believe that all of the 152 targets, and I'm not talking about the low-hanging fruit, so to say, that about trucking and cleaning and so forth, some of these technical services, like Guyanese doing 3D, seismic acquisition, well reservoir services, and so forth, another FPSO work, do you believe that that is practical in 10 years?
So two things to note about that. One, that it's a draft bill, and those are not final numbers. And now naturally, where we do not have a historical tendency to operate in that sector. So, for example, some of the more technical things, perhaps some of the targets can be scaled back, can be adjusted, can be looked at, or it can be drilled down a bit more. So, for example, instead of saying maybe 30% or 50% of the FPSO, perhaps construction has to be in country, how about having 50% of the labor that helps to construct the FPSO
Okay.
be Guyanese?
Well,
So
I think that they did say that. If you looked at the schedule, right, and you look at the end of the schedule, it said where they need labor, financing, right, or different segments. So they mean when they said that they want local participation on the FPSO, they actually said labor.
No, so the
So-
FPSO aspect was just mentioned as one example.
Right.
What I'm referring to
And the
specifically
other-
are the technical
And
work
they actually
where
said,
in the oil sector, it's required that you have a certain number of years of experience doing it with other companies, not just
Yeah.
developing the capacity or the technical know-how, but in having the experience and having to compete against companies
Right.
that already have been in the game for years.
Right.
so we have seen from the GCCI standpoint, we've just seen JV signed in Dubai. We received JV signed in Texas. GCCI has accommodated JVs when we fielded a mission to Newfoundland. There are numerous amounts of JVs that have been and partnerships that have signed out of our trip to Newfoundland. And of course, there's also a number of JVs that have been signed by members of the GCCI through our trip to Aberdeen. And so that is one way that Guyanese can get to that technical standpoint where they have the years of experience immediately. We just, I think it was Geico that signed an MOU, a tripartite MOU in Texas that makes them competitive in the industry immediately. And that is ways, and that's why the GCCI is forging over the years all these external missions and actually welcoming the internal missions and forging partnerships so that Guyanese can, and that's how we have the transfer of knowledge. That's how we have the transfer of technology. That's how we make Guyanese competitive right away, because they get those years of experience from the partner that they have signed on with, and it makes them competitive. That's how we were able to put Guyanese on a crewing vessel in Peru. That's how we were able to put Guyanese on a crewing vessel in Trinidad. And they actually, and just for the note, Trinidad objected to having 60% of the crew members being Guyanese. But the point, the fact of the matter is that through joint ventures and partnerships, this is where the GCCI has been pushing. That's why we are in Dubai. That's why we were at OTC. That's why we've been to offshore Europe in Aberdeen. That's why we've been to NIA and Noya in Newfoundland. That is why we are at all these oil and gas conventions, because we are linking our members to companies around the world that have the years of experience that Guyanese, yes, can do the remote vessel, can lay pipes, can do all these things through partnerships, joint ventures. And that's how we're going to be able to access that. So yes, some of the targets are high over 10 years. but the onus is on us to get ourselves ready and up to date.
Yeah, that's precisely where I was reaching to with my thought, because I was going to say at the beginning or at the introduction of the program, I had mentioned that we enter into partnerships, we enter into joint ventureships to accelerate ourselves along the learning curve. So it is not a case where we are someone has to be taught from maybe say secondary school petroleum engineering. But we have our expertise, we have the major component of business and business development, and we partner with someone who has the technical expertise. Now, will that be local in accordance with the definition of a Guyanese company? Therefore, we'll see that yes, right? Because it is a partnership. So that is one. And then secondly, so I was making 2 points. That was the first one. And then secondly, this goes back to what Timothy was saying. This is where the local content regulatory body, whether it's a petroleum commission with a local content committee or a local content commission itself, this is where it becomes very important, because the oil and gas sector and overall an oil and gas economy, or even outside of oil and gas, any resource-rich developing economy is not one which is static in nature. It is forever evolving, it is forever dynamic, and it is dynamic into perpetuity. And therefore we have to have institutions, legislation, and the architecture and the landscape to be able to handle that dynamism. So what we may not be able to nail down at this point in time when the local content legislation is assented to by His Excellency, we may be able to in 5 or 6 years revise that, get it right, align it, build capacity from now until then. So this is why the landscape too is very important, because it's not a be-all end-all at this point in time. We also have to have the architecture in place to be able to monitor, to be able to regulate.
Thank you for that point. Now, there's another issue that I'd like to get to, and I think you gentlemen mentioned it earlier, and that has to do with access to finance. It's been one of the number one or leading complaints or issues raised by businesses, that they don't have the access to it, and therefore they're hindered from being competitive as they would like to be. So how do you want to see the local content legislation address access to finance?
I don't believe the local content legislation can address access to finance. Richard is the economist, so he might be able to elaborate a little more on that. But from my position, I don't see it. I think that this requires a different look. This requires a revising, because we have engaged some of the bankers and we said, listen, why is it that Guyanese businesses are not being able to access finance easier, better instruments, of course, lower interest rates, and reduce that risk factor. So we have a law that says that you can only get 60 to 70% of your capital, your equity out of your holdings. So you have to have immovable assets, and you can only access 60 to 70% of that. They don't really trade. We don't get to borrow against movable assets. There's no asset registry. There's antiquated laws, slow-moving court system when it comes to banks foreclosing and being able to recover their money. So all of those things are combined. We need to really push forward in terms of upgrading our legal system so that we are able to let the banks be able to recover their money whenever that happens. And then some of the laws that are under the Bank of Guyana needs to be updated. We need to accept, maybe create a asset registry so that whatever you have, movable or immovable assets, can be, listed underneath your value. I mean, we look at people, and you see, Bill Gates worth $9 billion or whatever, 100 and something $billion. That's everything that he owns. movable or removable assets, stocks, everything in his valuation. That's how he's able to get a credit rating. That's how he's able to access finance based on that. Here is different. Only the immovable property that's in your name is what you can borrow against. And you can only borrow 60 to 70%, I think, maybe 60% of it, roughly. So that gives us a restriction. Of course, the fact of the matter is that some parts of the world, you're able to get a guarantee from your employer or your contractor, whatever, who's employing you, so that you can say, well, I'll borrow against my existing contract so I can fulfill that contract. Some of the banks allow you to do it on government contracts if you are a large enough entity. We've not been seeing that in the oil and gas industry. So that's been very difficult, that you're not being able to borrow against your invoicing, or your receivables, or your contract. So that is some of the issues that you're seeing, and that's why you have that access to finance situation. Of course, and Guyana, our AML situation creates a different set of problems. It's a very complex and a long-winded situation here, why we don't have that access. And we really need to try our best as a country to clear those hurdles and get past those access to finance problems. As I said, Richard is the economist, and Richard might be able to give you the direct reason for it. He's more familiar with that part of the issue. But I mean, as a businessman, I'm able to give you the frontline answer.
Yeah.
Yes, Richard.
Yeah. So Kiana, the short answer of it is that local content legislation or whatever local content instrument can't address access to finance. We in the private sector don't view local content or a local content instrument. Maybe let's just say legislation, because that's where we are now. We don't view it as being a silver bullet. Local content legislation or policy has 4 parts to it: procurement, or opportunities for businesses, opportunities for local employees, transfer of technology, and accountability and transparency through penalties, etc. Those are the 4 components. But this, Kiana, raises a very important point, which is the intersection that local content, oil and gas, etc. has with the competitiveness of the economy, where barriers to competitiveness, shortfalls in the competitive environment, problems in terms of conditions of doing business. Those are those external conditions to doing business that we talk about. And then internal conditions that companies may have. For example, not being able to keep proper records, not being able to reach the standards, not being able to look at accurate forecasting. Those ought to be addressed, because when I would have spoken earlier about being commercially uncompetitive, or not being able to access opportunities as a result of not being commercially viable, that's where we need further support to be able to drive competitiveness of business, to be able to drive the opportunities for enterprises through the development. And I'll tell you something, Kiana. I think looking at, in particular, the current administration's track record as it relates to competitiveness, I'm confident that we will be able to get it right. The reason I say that is because even pre-oil and gas, even pre-rise in gold prices, we would have seen the establishment of the National Competitiveness Council, the NCCC in Guyana. We would have seen the implementation of the National Competitiveness Strategy, which actually gave birth to competitive enterprises in Guyana within a regional context. Now, what we really do need at this point, and I think that we will eventually get there in the near future, it's a resuscitation of things like the NCC, institutions like the NCC, and mechanisms like the NCC, and revivals of things like the National Competitiveness Strategy within the context of an oil and gas economy. So, historically, we have explored ways in which we can increase our competitiveness, and I am confident that we will get there. Local content itself is not a silver bullet. It is a very important instrument, but it is only one within an entire arsenal of various instruments that have to be implemented and have to be utilized for us in Guyana to be able to get it correct.
And we got
Thank you for that, Richard. But I just wanted to add that the reason for my even asking the question in the first place is that there are several African countries, producers, that have put provisions in place for oil companies to make contributions to a local content fund. That fund is then used to give startup companies an opportunity to access contracts if they're procurement or what's not. They're able to get part of it. Of course, there are transparent reporting requirements that they have to adhere to. And I do believe that the previous administration had made some effort to try to get a local content fund in place. That didn't go anywhere. But it was in that sense that the question was asked, because while you do have the overarching issues that need to be addressed, like the interest on finance on loans that you would take from the banks, etc., there are still some other mechanisms that can be utilized, such as the local content fund for companies that are trying to start up.
I'll let Timothy take that because I know he has some innovative ideas in that regard, and then I'll perhaps answer after.
There's a very important aspect that's clearly why we need more than one operator finding oil in Guyana. Because you have mentioned just now that you have multiple operators in those African countries, and that's important. When you have multiple operators, it makes it easier for things like local content, access to finance, because there are more players. When you bring more players into the country, you have a de-risking factor, right, with the access to finance. Then you can be able to say, well, put the funds together. GCCI has said, and we've tasked with doing that in terms of creating the mechanism to help small businesses. We are presently working on that forum in terms of internally investment portal and various mechanisms to try and boost the access to capital for small businesses via the private sector. I have raised that issue that you just mentioned with the government, and they've basically said the government had said that they were supportive of whatever the private sector comes up with in a mechanism that can pool money together to help startups and small and medium businesses to lift and get that access that they need. And again, when everybody is we're living in a country that at this point in time we have one father, and everybody's going to that one father, right, which is ExxonMobil, for everything. And that becomes even though that they're the ones that are reaping, right? It's weird that when we have, and you know the old trick, when you're a child and you have two fathers, then you can play both of them. So that's why we need to have multiple fathers in terms of multiple operators in the country, so that we can be able to get more as a country. And I've said that openly over the years, that I'm hoping that CGX or Repsol hits oil out there and that we have more than one operator, because it's not beneficial for Guyana to only be dealing with one operator, because then we can't get the things that you've just alluded to. And we might not be able to do so because we have to depend on one person, one company alone to give us everything that we want. There are mechanisms in place at this point in time for training of persons. I know the government is rapidly trying to get persons trained and using the funds to get those persons trained. But there are multiple mechanisms that need to be put in place to get that access to finance. And I don't think it's so much as startups, right? Because we have some of the banks and we have the Small Business Bureau. Well, what the businesses that really need is those businesses that are in a unique position. They're not small enough to get grant funding or a small business loan, but they're not large enough to have the the assets, they have not acquired the assets to use that asset to leverage to operate on a bigger level. And they're direct center, and those are the hardest. That's your upper, small, and the medium businesses. That is a unique category that has been overlooked by everyone. That is the category that really needs that help in any way possible, and that's what the GCCI has been trying to formulate that mechanism that can really help that upper small and medium businesses to really propel them to be competitive, whether it is in the oil and gas industry or whether it is in any other industry that is required. And that is where we are at this point. And we've had many different conversations, and we're working on different ideas and different plans to try and get that going. I did not know what you just told me, and I will be the first to admit it. But
But just for the record as well, because this is a knowledge exchanging discourse. So in those African countries, every company that wants access to explore, you have to contribute in some way. So even if you're not contributing, or even if you're not asked to make a sizable contribution in terms of local content, you're asked to make a sizable contribution towards fees that have to do with the environment, or you have responsibilities under different areas. So perhaps it's something that we can definitely look at as the industry advances. But Richard, before we conclude, you wanted to share a point as well based on what Timothy has said.
Well, the only point that I wanted to make is of course what you were speaking about a short while back, is that I do believe that mechanisms of such sort as you just described are very important. But fundamentally, I don't think that we should, as citizens of Guyana, hold or place the onus of economic development of this country on a single private sector enterprise, whether it be an IOC, etc. I think that those are ways to make them more responsible. Those are ways to have them contribute to our economic development process. But we really do have to, and it's an important instrument that you would have mentioned, but there are conditions, like Timothy would have mentioned, have to be in place before those things can occur. So, for example, competitiveness in the exploration and production, etc. But really, what we need is a continuation of what we've been seeing, particularly in recent history in Guyana, where it refers to the fact that citizens are holding the leaders that they elect into office accountable for their actions and for what they're doing. And I think that in Guyana, we are beginning to see that more. And that certainly is where we have to place our focus on. We also, to Guyana, and I don't want to forget this, we also have to place focus on each and every individual or each and every enterprise. Because we oftentimes in Guyana, I say, and I've been saying this for years, we sometimes suffer almost from a complaining syndrome, where we complain. But there are many things on either an individual or on an individual company basis which we certainly have to improve. We don't pretend as if, all Guyanese persons are absolutely perfect, all Guyanese enterprises are absolutely perfect. There are areas for improvement, and it is that individual sense of responsibility too which is needed for improvement of the country. So I think that Guyana's future and Guyana's prospects are bright, but we certainly do need to ensure that we learn the lessons which have been demonstrated to us by other countries. We need to be cognizant of where we are going to head if we take certain decisions, and we certainly do need to ensure that at all points in times we are accountable for what we do as a people.
Interesting that you made that remark there, because my concluding question for both of you is to provide us with your outlook of Guyana's future as an oil industry and how you want to see the business community fit into that perspective?
My conclusion, and to answer that question, would definitely be that as a country, we have to realize and recognize what is in front of us.
Mm-hmm.
But we must be aware of what also is around us, right? So even though we look at it and we recognize that we have oil in Guyana and it's at 85 or $80 a barrel, we must also look at countries around us that have more than us.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at Venezuela, we are, celebrating at 11 and 12 million or 15 million barrels of oil, and they have 11 or 12 billion barrels, and they have 300 billion barrels of oil, and look at where they are. And we must recognize around the world that is also the case. There are many countries around the world that have embargoes, sanctions, going through turmoil. So we are, our country, as a country, have to capitalize on the opportunity that's in front of us and use it to catapult us out of where we are to where we want to be. And where we want to be is not of a country that is filled with potholes, blackouts, garbage, inability for good health, education, access to finance, and the quality, the human index must improve, right? Our goals, the way we live, Guyanese must not dream of leaving Guyana. People should be dreaming of coming to Guyana. And that is a country that we want to create. And we have to use the resources that are here in front of us to create that country that Guyanese want to stay in, Guyanese that left want to return to, and people around the world want to come to. We all, the entire world runs to many different countries. And we've been a country, and our citizens have been placed on benches, have been put in back rooms, have been deported, have been shamed. And that needs to be the end of that. We need to have a country and have a people and develop a country that, listen, here is the second best or the best place in the world to live. And that's what we need to develop, and that's how we want to see our country. And we have to use the resources that are in front of us to create that. And we also have to remember that there's a resource curse. That if we depend on oil at $85 a barrel and we end up with $20 barrel oil, that we can end up like other countries, that everything collapses. So we must use the revenue and this to develop a country that is sustainable without oil and gas. Agriculture, we know gold mining, we know everything, all the 6 other natural resources or 6 other things that we used to survive on over the years. And we've always cried for value added. We said, listen, if we can add value to these products, in these natural resources that we had, we create a good country. So use that to create the mechanisms that creates the value added so that we can progress on that. And you have to remember, not because you're an agro-processor, a fish farmer, or whatever else you are, or a livestock miner, that you have no place in the oil and gas economy. Yes, you do. You have to raise your standard, traceability, right? Phytosanitary, packaging, and create the best product so that we can say that is local content. That is the meat, that is the produce, that is the juice, that is the ketchup, that is the pepper sauce that you need to use because it's created locally to the highest standards in the world. And that is the country that we want to build.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tucker. Mr. Rambaran, I'll ask you for your closing remarks.
Sure. So, Timothy raised some very important points. And like I would have mentioned, not because we have oil and gas or not because there is a local content legislation that is going to be put in place means that that is a silver bullet. Similarly or parallel for the economy, not because we have oil and gas, that means that it's a silver bullet for our economic development. Now, more often than not, we have seen resource-rich developing economies, and I'm not going to just say oil and gas because other resource-rich countries have faltered too, but resource-rich developing economies more often than not have a tendency to fail. What we need to do as a country, and which I'm confident that we will do, is that we need to take lessons from those countries. We look around the world, we see what's happening in Venezuela. If we pick up the international news as of today, we can see what's happening in Nigeria, a country which is almost on the verge of being ungovernable at this point. So really, we need to ensure that we learn from those lessons. And I recently gave a public lecture to Rotary where I was speaking about inclusive growth and why that is important for a resource-rich developing economy. It is underscored in the context that each and every Guyanese citizen must be able to benefit, whether it's through proper health care, proper education, all of the factors which act as factors that prevent the thought of migration. We need as much or as many hands on board to drive our economic development process. And really, one of the things I think from a development perspective is that we need to continue to see what we've been seeing so far, which is that the private sector takes a lead role in development, with the government of the day or governments of the day providing that enabling environment, supporting legislation, supportive infrastructure, etc. And to ensure that when we do have this massive windfall, because we are nowhere near where we will be at peak production, when we do have that massive windfall, that we do not suffer the same fate as many of those countries, that we lift the standard of living of all Guyanese to, at bare minimum, something that is internationally recognized as being a good standard of living, our human development index being high, and to ensure that we do not have vast or pronounced inequalities where only those who are earning can benefit, and those who are earning have to live in gated communities, for example, because if they step outside the gated communities, they're at risk of being robbed or mugged or gunned down or something. We have examples to show of that from countries. So that is essentially where I want to see Guyana go. I want to see Guyana in a position where each citizen can enjoy a high quality of life. The private sector must be developed in taking a lead role, and the government must play an infrastructure, legislative, institutional development and supporting role in the economy. So I look forward to seeing that Guyana. I think that we have a great opportunity to be able to do that, one that is unprecedented in the history, perhaps of any resource-rich developing economy. And I look forward to that happening because some of the signs and the signals which we are seeing are positive and tend to go in that direction.
Mr. Rambaran, Mr. Tucker, thank you very much for being part of tonight's discussion on Guyana's Oil and You. It was certainly enlightening to hear the perspectives of two very key men in the business community, and I do hope we can have you back sometime in the future to continue this discourse on the importance of local content and the role of the business community in all of this. Once again, thank you, and to our listeners and viewers, As usual, thank you for being part of the discussion. We hope to have you back next week, same time, same place. Until then, please continue to stay safe and wear your mask wherever you go. Please practice social distancing. Good evening, gentlemen, and thank you for tuning in tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kian.